The panel, the topic is National Action Plan on Energy Transition, and we have three speakers in this session. Ms. Ulka Kelkar. We have with us Mrs. Ulka Kelkar. She is currently working as Executive Director, Climate WRI India. She has more than 24 years of experience in climate change research, outreach and capacity. The second speaker is Dr. Amarendra Mishra. He is currently working as Chairperson, Development and Environment Future Trust. He was also former professor of Terry University. And we have Dr. Gopal Kumar Sarangi, faculty Terry School of Urban Studies, and he has specialization in energy economics, climate change, energy regulation and energy access. So without wasting our time, let me invite Mrs. Ulka Kelkar to deliver her talk.
Thank you very much. I very much for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you. I work with a research institute called WRI India, and I'm based in the Bangalore office. Today I'll be presenting mainly based on national analysis that we have done using a systems dynamics model called the Energy Policy Simulator. And I'll try to draw some linkages to the eastern Indian region or to Odisha particularly. So when we have a systems model where not only the power sector but also the industry and transport and buildings and all these sectors are put in together, we see that going forward in the future, the yellow band that you see is the power sector, the electricity sector. And we see that even in the reference scenario, the business as usual scenario, power sector emissions do not increase. They are not projected to become wider. They are flattening out. And this is because of all of these Panchamrit targets that you've been hearing about, because of the decline in the cost of solar electricity and so on. However, what you see is that grey band, which is the industry sector. And we find that in 2050, half of India's emissions could come from the industry sector, largely steel, cement. And that's why the conversation that we were having just before the break about the steel sector and captive power plants and all that becomes extremely important. In the reference scenario, we find that by 2030, 60% of non-fossil electricity capacity gets built in this model, which looks at cost optimization. It also has some amount of technology learning, so technologies become cheaper over time to some extent. But in the net zero 2070 scenario, we find that much more renewable energy will need to be built in order to eventually for India's emissions to come down towards net zero by 2070. In fact, we find that by 2050, at least 90% of the electricity capacity has to come from non-fossil fuel sources. This model goes up to 2050 only. You see the yellow, which is the solar, which is increasing. You see the light blue, which is the wind. You also see the grey, which is coal, which is not disappearing. Right? Even in 2050, there is a small amount of coal. So this is what we refer to as phase down rather than phase out. But why this is important is that it will create a transition in other sectors as well. Transport, electric mobility as it is coming in, will run on cleaner electricity. In buildings, as there is more electrification of cooking, lighting, more efficiency, all of that is running on cleaner electricity. Industry, we've already spoken about, as much as possible, running on cleaner electricity. Now, I will focus today in my comments on some of the macroeconomic implications of this energy transition, particularly focusing on the employment implications. In this model, we have an integrated input-output table for India, which lets us look at what the impacts might be on jobs. We do also look at implications for the import bill, for tax revenue and so on, but today I will talk only about the employment effects. So you see the line at the bottom, which is mining and raw material extraction, and we see a decline in jobs in the future. Naturally, as we shift away from fossil fuels, there is a decline. We see small increases in the manufacturing sector, but significant increases in jobs in the construction sector, utilities sector, and services sector. Why is this happening? Because we are building so much of renewable energy, we are building green hydrogen, we are creating more, thank you very much, induced jobs as well, in order to maintains, servicing, repair of electric vehicles. All of these are coming in. So the total impact is a positive impact. But if we go deeper and break up that manufacturing line that you saw, which was a positive increase, we see certain specific trends. For example, when it comes to basic metals production, there is a projected decline. But when it comes to more specialized manufacturing, like fabricated metal products or electrical and electronic equipment, we see a positive increase. So this has very important implications for states like Odisha if they want to prepare for the economic benefits of the low carbon transition. What this means is there is a potential for jobs to get created, provided that there is skilling done in those jobs, and provided that even, say, for example, women are able to access those skilling programs. So this gives us some trends for the future. India's energy transition will also have, as we've been hearing about since morning, regional disparities. This map only juxtaposes the existing coal power plants with the wind power plants. And you can see the very obvious pattern where wind power is more concentrated in the west and the south, and coal is concentrated more in the north and the east. If we look specifically at Odisha and we look at, on the one hand, coal power plants operational and in the pipeline, and on the other hand, solar power plants operational and in the pipeline, we see that there isn't enough yet of renewable energy being built in order to sort of offset or compensate or match, let's say, the amount of coal that is there in the system. This is very different from other states. And this data may be a few months out of date. The vasudhapower.in is a very good source of data for young researchers over here. But definitely this is something that the state needs to plan for. I'll now digress a little bit and share a few findings from a field survey that we did of a large solar park in Karnataka, the state where I am based. This is one of the largest solar parks in India, and the model over here was not for farmers to sell their land to the solar park, but to lease their land. And it's a fairly good option for farmers because this is a very rain-fed, semi-arid area. Farming is not a very lucrative option over here. But what happens, we find through this survey, is that the land under cultivation declined drastically, naturally because the land is going under solar. And the landless laborers who were being employed by the land-owning cultivators, their employment also declined by 82%. Now we have compared this with the neighboring villages where there wasn't a solar park, because obviously there is an ongoing trend of migration towards cities. So we're just trying to compare with the controlled trend. And we find that as a result of the solar park, 82% of workers declined as compared to 12% only. And the solar park itself is not hiring that many people. There are some jobs for security guards, maybe for cutting the grass. No women are employed in the solar park. Those who do tend to be employed tend to be those who own the land and had some kind of deals. There's also a lot of livestock farming in these regions, and we find that here also the households practicing livestock farming declined by 42% compared with 8% in the neighboring farms. What does this mean really for, not just for Karnataka, but for any state in India that is considering going in for utility scale solar? One is that there is an opportunity to consider agri-photovoltaics. That is, you have a coexistence of solar panels and perhaps some amount of livestock grazing, pastoralism, maybe vegetables as well. There are different models that are being tried out in the country. There's an India Agrivoltaics Alliance as well that is looking at some pilots. The other opportunity is for decentralized renewable energy, and clearly there is a lot of efforts, lot of initiatives that are already being done in the country. This example is from Assam, and the interesting thing about it is not the technology, which is a very simple rooftop solar for the cold storage for potatoes, which is being operated by a self-help group, but the business model, the payment model. How do you make sure that this is a self-sustaining model for the women's self-help group? They're even able to rent it out to others. This is an example from Jharkhand, which is a ragi processing unit, and here also the women were able to get an improvement in their income as a result of running this mill on solar or rooftop solar rather than on fossil fuels. This is an example of a small rural hospital in Jharkhand which was able to install rooftop solar and was able to run ventilators even during the COVID pandemic, and in fact became a COVID center because it had reliable round-the-clock electricity, as opposed to the previous example where they either had to depend on the grid or they had to spend a lot of money on diesel. So these are some of the examples of decentralized renewable energy which the state might want to actively prepare for as part of its energy transition. But my last slide is that of really actively seeking out opportunities for creating new circular economy livelihoods. In the next 5-10 years, there will be solar panels that will get decommissioned. There will be wind turbines that will get decommissioned, perhaps for repowering of wind, and there isn't an easy way to recycle wind turbines. There is an opportunity to recycle steel scrap for electric arc furnaces. And there is a great opportunity really for this part of the country where, I think reference was made earlier in the morning about human resources, about relatively cheaper labor, to be skilled, to be able to handle these relatively high value streams of waste and to actually supply the critical minerals through an urban mining kind of model that will actually power the rest of the country's energy transition and energy security. So let me just end with that.
I'd like to invite Dr. Arvind Misra.
Come up here. Greetings to all. I think it is safe to still wish, best to extend best wishes of the New Year. It's still time, January is still there. So Happy New Year to all. So I am Amarendra here. I am representing a small think tank set up with the initiative of a few friends, like-minded friends. It's called the Development and Environment Futures Trust. We are located in Bhubaneswar. But prior to that, I was in TERI as the Director of Climate Change Division for 10 years, also in TERI University as a Professor of Public Policy. I was 7 years at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development in Kathmandu, Singapore, looking at 8 countries in the climate change projects that were happening. So that gives me a reasonable perspective on what climate action is all about. So that's the kind of a perspective that I bring to this gathering. And also as a social scientist, I think particularly when we talk about energy transition, we hear a lot about technology developments. We hear a lot about economics analysis, not so much about the political dynamics. Thank you, Odisha, for bringing that out, and also the sociological aspects, for example, the gender dimensions. And unfortunately, over the past decade, social science research and energy transition has not really grown. So we still have a large domain where we have very limited understanding, and that also explains why energy transition, which is being considered as the biggest, development project for India, and underlying development project, not a climate action, but it's a development project for India. You have large masses of the people, forget about common people, even the academicians, they, turn away when you start talking about energy transition. They don't feel comfortable. They're not, engaged with the subject. So why is that? That this has not gone down to, the real, cream of, or the broader spectrum of academic research. So I think some demystification is always necessary. Anyway, I'm here to share some of my thoughts. I thought this is a good opportunity, and thank you, Amarendra, for providing this opportunity. 5-6 points. The first is, I was impressed by Mandeep Saab's, the global context setting, and that resonates so well with what I'm going to, start at the beginning. that when we talk about energy transformation or transition, large part of it is driven by interests beyond climate change. Climate change as a driver, or climate action as a driver, occupies a very little part actually when we talk about energy transition. This is from a very good analysis by Kurtz, and they talk about the driving force coming from the industry segment, which is all about competitiveness. And economics actually underscores that when it comes to energy transformation, industry is motivated not so much by how much they are contributing to climate action. It's the implication as far as to the industry sector on competitiveness, global competitiveness. Capital, we are talking about energy transformation, nobody has talked about finance. And that's, deploy the kind of technology at the scale that we want. It's all about how much finance can be mobilized. And finance is not at all motivated by, climate action. Finance is about, risky markets. What is their perception about, the kind of instruments that are coming out. Even when we talk about carbon markets emerging or the, financial incentives coming from the policy sector, non-fossil assets getting into corporate, ledgers is not going to happen unless they, are fully, they're fully, acknowledging the risks that come with these non-fossil assets and have ways of hedging these risks. So unless that happens, you won't see finance, big finance coming into it, particularly big institutional finance. At the moment, it is still being considered as a bubble. Carbon markets are still being considered as a bubble. So that's a big concern. Then you have security sector, and what happens, Russia, Ukraine, and the Middle East. And the Middle East, the situation is progressing in such a way that it has become very uncertain, especially when it comes to energy markets in general. Energy markets, it has become very tight because of what we are seeing in Middle East. And there it is all about geopolitics. So you have all these influences on the kind of energy transformation that is likely to happen in the Indian context. And given this context, and given the kind of games that are being played in the climate negotiations arena, it's really very hard to predict how the transition story is going to play out in the Indian context. And that's where I thought, if you visualize transition as a journey, then we should be kind of careful about dead ends, about diversions, and about decoys. So in a journey, this will emerge. So how prepared we are to kind of anticipate dead ends that may emerge because of finance not flowing in, because it still stays risky, or technological capabilities, while they develop at the large scale level, at the macro level, not really developing at the decentralized, localized, downscale level. So it is, the kind of a, if you have a rooftop solar, do you have the number of if anything happens to that system, do you have the number of a technician who can come and then correct it? So that's the kind of localized capacity, is it happening? If there is, EV that is coming in, do we have charging stations that are coming up which are, easily accessible, easily deployable? So what's that kind of low scale, we are not very far from Chilika Lake here. And it has been a funny story when it comes to ecological conservation there, particularly fitting the boats, fishing boats, with solar, because these are diesel-driven boats. And at one point of time, the government, placed a case before the Odisha High Court asking for a restriction on the use of diesel boats. and the High Court passed an order that they should all be converted to solar powered boats. Obviously, it didn't work because that technology has not been developed. That you have that kind of a pump that can be deployed at the boat level, and when the kind of one of the concerns, for example, the fishermen, they told us that anytime when they go far into the sea, far into the lagoon for collecting fish, very often there is a disaster, there is a cyclonic storm that emerges. With a solar power boat, they cannot come back that easily as compared to a diesel boat. So that's the kind of a granularity in terms of understanding what are the needs and developing the right kind of technology for that. So what happens is, funnily, now the government is arguing before the court that diesel boats be allowed to, go into Chilika for livelihood sake. So that's where the disconnects happen. While the technological development is discussed at a scale that I do not understand. For example, when we talk about large scale technology, I am more concerned with what I can fit in my house, what I can fit in my city, and that technological development, decentralized, localized, that I am not seeing happening. So that's a big gap, and that can lead to a dead end when we are talking about a energy transition pathway. So these are dead ends, from finance, from technology. Diversions. I think, when we talk about a journey, definitely there will be diversions that you will be required to take. And that requires a certain degree of anticipation in our institutional capabilities. That requires a certain degree of agility in our governance capabilities, which can help us take the diversions when required. Do we have those institutional capabilities in our governance agencies, particularly at the frontline level? Often, you may have at a very centralized level, DST, ministry level, those kind of understanding and the capabilities may be there. But when it comes to very frontline agencies, you may not be having that agility to really anticipate and maneuver to the extent that is required. So diversions, being prepared for that, and that requires a lot of data that data-driven understanding of what is required of policy making, which may not be happening at this stage. As I said, while we have a lot of focus on the technology side, on the economic side even, we don't have that much on the people's part of it. So yes, energy transition is required, but how much of a people-centric energy transition we are having, that's the big question, unless we have other disciplines coming into the field, and which is not happening. Then, as I said, decoys. When you go, you will see decoys. And I'm going to put in an argument which may not be politically correct at this stage. I find, when we say that decarbonization and low carbon growth paths are going to open up a market, I think that's a big decoy for a country like India. We are getting into a trap which the developed countries entered into and are trying desperately to get out of it. Yes, there is a big market there, but are we really concerned at this stage of development, where we have the scale of energy poverty that we see, where the kind of development situation that we are in, are we really going to have a transition-led development paradigm, or is it worth considering a development-led transition paradigm? And fundamentally, these are two different. And I feel, and I'm going to argue in favor of a development-led transition paradigm, that you have your development priorities first. I think Dr. Naik actually presented, and I like that, what's our water security need, what's our food security need, what's our energy security need. So these are our development priorities, and from there actually the transition requirements gets translated. Unfortunately, what we are seeing, what actually I am perceiving, is that the focus has become so much on the transition part that we focus on what's possible on the transition side. Yes, we can bring in solar, we can bring in wind, we can go for a ethanol market, maybe become the third biggest ethanol market in few years' time. But what does that achieve? What does this all add up to in terms of in terms of our development scenarios? When we start predicting all this, it's not really giving that kind of a scenario, and that's why probably a lot of stakeholders are still disengaged. I feel it's a much better way to look at the development scenarios 20 years hence, 30 years hence, and then work out what may be the low carbon pathways to achieve this thing. And that will require a completely different approach to resource allocation, to our budgeting pathways, to our building of capabilities, to governance even. It will not be an easy path, but that's a paradigm shift that I think would be required very much. Otherwise, if we start looking at the transition-led development strategies, we are all the way, all the time trying to equip ourselves for addressing more and more energy-intensive pathways. Consider, for example, that if we look at the past 1 decade, every year, take the household sector only. Every year, almost 5 crore consumers have been added in terms of getting electrical connections. And if we look into the future, next 20 years, just the household sector, consider the electricity demand. You will have a almost like a humongous demand that has to be met. Forget about the MSME sector, forget about the industry demand for electricity. It is simply the household sector, the urban transport sector, the sector, the city needs for electricity, which is going to be so huge that trying to address all of these through conventional renewable energy means it's going to be extremely challenging. What I would say, it's almost impossible. If we go that far, that way, it will be always trying to catch up with a goal. Rather, if we talk about a development transition, it's all about lifestyle changes. And I think something that is not getting the attention it should be deserving is the mission life. And it's a bit of a paradox actually that whenever I speak about mission life to even the central ministries, they say इसमें तो कुछ नहीं होने वाला है. It is simply as if everyone is understanding that as to be something just as a rhetoric. But what I feel is that that's the way where the solution lies actually. To talk about large-scale lifestyle changes and accordingly talk about energy needs and then what the kind of transformation. For example, in Odisha, we don't need a conference hall like this. That's always the point that I make in any conference hall. When you talk about energy, transition, the buildings are a misfit with our energy usage pattern. So that's just an example. So anyway, the point that I was trying to make is that big finance is required, and we don't have capabilities to mobilize that kind of a finance or to handle that kind of a finance. So should we be thinking of a specialized agency? Thoughts to ponder. Should we be thinking of a green bank, a bank that talks about actually that learns, that has the capacity to handle environmental finance or the climate finance, let us say. And particularly when it comes to governance, being aware of the trade-offs and also the prioritization across different horizons. When we talk about the transformation pathway, we try to bundle the supply side and the demand side. But I think it is useful to separate these two out. Most of the supply side for the different energy resources, they are probably beyond the control. But for the demand side, I think there is a potential to save the demand. I think I heard that phrase, saving the demand. I think that can be, particularly for regulatory agencies to have that capacity to save the demand so that it is in line with the kind of transformation pathways that are being tried out. So I think that is something that one can actually think of. and particularly, the gap, as I said, at the localized scale, frontline agencies' capabilities, technology development at the local scale. I think with the kind of technology that the deployment that is happening, more of that kind of a deployment, massive scale. Now it is very limited, and particularly when we look at Odisha context, very little of these kind of technologies are being really deployed and becoming really sustainable. The best example is cold storage units, and I think there are studies. I think Amarendra, you had that some workshop. Odisha Economic Association did that workshop, and where we actually presented that when we look at cold storage units in Odisha, very few of them, a very small percentage is functional, continues to be functional once the subsidies are removed, once the project support is removed. So why is it that happening? That's a big question. Unless those localized challenges are addressed, it will be very difficult to actually have a sustainable energy transition pathway. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Dr. Sarangi from Perry School of Advanced Studies to deliver his speech. You have some 10 to 12 minutes.
Thank you so much. I won't take that much time. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Das and NISER for inviting me to here. And what I feel is that after speaking Ulkaji and Sir, I think I have nothing much to deliberate on this issue, because most of the critical issues have already been covered by Ulkaji and Arvind Sir. But I'll do that, I'll just draw some insights from both the speakers, and I'd like to highlight a few things which are in fact adding to the complexities which have been spoken about. The nature of the transition that we're talking about are two scales. One is the global scale, which has already been spoken by Puri Sir and others, Grover Sir as well also, and the decentralized scale, particularly spoken by Ulkaji and Arvind Sir. One of those issues is basically that the nature of this transition is intersectoral and interscalar. And when we talk about intersectorality, I mean, what I see is that what we don't understand is that when we talk about, let's for example, we're talking about electricity sector getting connected with the transport sector at a higher level. But when we bring that down, as has been pointed out by Sir just now, is that it's really very challenging to dissect that. Why is it so? It's because of the fact that when you're actually thinking of expanding the renewable energy capacity and trying to bring transport sector, there have been studies done by ORF, done by in fact the CPR and others, looking at what would be the load addition when we bring the transport sector into the electric sector. But what is not being discussed is that if that load addition is not made through renewables, because if the capacity addition is not happening, the one is that you increase the capacity but the generation is not happening, then there is a disruption. There is some kind of disturbances in terms of the fact that you are essentially relocating the pollution. Relocating the pollution in the sense that you increase the number of electric vehicles in Delhi and Mumbai, become the number 1 and number 2 cities in terms of the addition of electric vehicles. But importantly, what you are not doing is that you are actually expanding the thermal power capacity in Odisha. So what about that? Who is going to take care of that? That's one issue which has not been really given that much attention. Second is essentially the fact that inter-scalar issues. Internationally, we are talking about the fact that the geopolitics, Puri Sir has already spoken about that, is that geopolitics is actually changing. And importantly, the change what we observe is that we are moving from oil and gas towards solar panel. Now we are moving from solar panels to critical minerals. They are not happening in a compartmentalized manner. It's like rather overlapping. So we are still importing oil and gas. We are still continuing to import solar panels from China. At the same time, we are also configuring that we will have to identify certain countries for our critical minerals. Now, what would happen to that kind of a change? Are you actually prepared for that kind of a change? So this is something which has not really been given that much of attention, even though there have been regional kind of groupings happening. India is partnering with Australia and USA for critical minerals. That issue has not been really given that much attention. I'll just bring one more dimension to that international scholar issue, is that the discussion that we had while coming back is that Bhutan is a net zero country. Now Bhutan is asking India that if you are spilling over your carbon emissions to us, give us money. Now what would happen to that? So are you really, whether you have the ability to pay for the carbon emissions you're spilling out to the country, or is it actually worth discussion at the international level? Green hydrogen being discussed. Now the issue is that when we talk about green hydrogen, there is also discussion happening that Nepal and Bhutan are actually rich in hydro. Now is it something that we need to collaborate, because you need a lot of water for green hydrogen, as it was pointed out by Grover sir in the morning. So is it going to worth kind of an arrangement that is going to happen? Not only that, there is also, as I said, that the market is also getting regionalized. Because earlier we were importing oil and gas from Middle East countries. Now there is a possibility that there has been studies by World Bank which has been pointing out the fact figure that the market for energy is going to be regional, and it would probably good for India. Why? There is something called flexibility. Renewable energy runs through the characteristic of flexibility. If you have, and there have been studies which essentially specifically focus on the fact that there is something called load complementarity. What does it mean? Essentially means that when India has the peak load, Nepal and Bhutan do not have. That whether, if that is kind of situation, can we cut down our peak load, your energy assets? Will it be beneficial for us? So these are the issues which are coming up in the large scale. When you think of the large scale, global scale, at high level discussion in energy transition, these issues are actually issues which have not been given the attention which it deserves. Now let me come back to the discussion at the decentralized scale, drawing from what Professor Mishra has already said, is basically the rate of change, which you also mentioned about the rate of change. Because when you look at Glasgow, we talked about phasing out and phasing down. But when we talk about COP28, we were there together last month, we are basically talking about the rate of change. They are asking us that whether it will be incremental change or a radical change. Now, are you going to call it a transformation or are you going to call it a transition? Because the rate of change holds crucial importance for all of us. Why is it so? It's primarily because of the fact that the kind of negative impacts pointed out by Urkaji very clearly, that if you are actually transiting at a radical rate, the employment effects which is directly coming out will be significant. Now, if you are going for a modification instead of complete transformation, so the negative impacts could possibly be minimized. So the rate of change is something which has not really given that much of attention, and there has been very less research which talks about what is the rate. Will that rate be uniform across sectors which are going to face the transformation, or is it going to be different for different sectors? I'll just draw one more interesting aspect to this, is that the discussion that we are actually focusing on energy transition is all probably maybe driven by the climate change right now, but there have been other areas of transformation which has been happening. I'll just give one example of that, is the energy reforms, the sector which has been experiencing for the last 30 years. In fact, Odisha is the pioneering state which reformed its electricity sector. Now almost like 30 years of reform we have. Now, if you look at the way the energy sector is actually transforming, what is happening is that there has been a change in terms of the moving away from a regulated regime towards a market regime, where the price discovery was happening through the regulated mode. Electricity regulators were doing that. Now we are actually allowing auctions, let's for example. So auctions are now the new mode of discovering the wind and solar price. Now there are a lot of issues with auctions, all of us know that. Now interestingly, when we talk about these auctions, now what extent that is people-centric? Because there have been studies indicating that if you are actually, because all the auctions in the wind and the solar space are more driven by cutting the cost rather than looking at the ethical dimension, gender dimension. There have been issues. There is something called your winner's cost. And if you look at what is happening in the wind energy auctions, there have been many projects awarded but actually not commissioned. There is no land, no water, there are issues related to acquiring land. So are you really prepared for that kind of change, which has to be integrated with the energy transition discourse that we are discussing? Now, sir also referred about carbon market. I like to understand about that, because the carbon market essentially, when you talk about carbon market kind of an architecture for Indian context, because if you look at the emission profile, like NISER presented in the morning about the emission profile, and if you look at India's share, Even though India is the third largest emitter, the absolute share is only 7%. That essentially means that whatever you do, you can only reduce 7% of the global emission, not more than that. China and the US are far, far ahead of us, far ahead, 4 times more than what we emit, in absolute terms. Now the question is that if carbon market that we are actually, the architecture has come on, is it going to be a market to reduce the carbon emissions, or is it a market which would help us to mobilize funds? Then if you really want to mobilize funds, there is a discussion happened recently, I was part of the meeting by Government of India, is that whether we can actually create our market which will be robust and accepted by the internationally accepted markets like, let's say, European Union ETS. If that's not happening, then the problem is that your carbon credits, because a whole lot of discussion around carbon market is carbon leakages, political economy dimension, the quality of carbon credits, particularly in the voluntary carbon market. If the carbon credits that are generated in India is not going to be accepted internationally, what do we do? How can we mobilize funds? So these discussions require more attention if you really want to go to the granularity of the kind of thing that are actually trying to bring in. I'll just say the last one and stop. One is that there has been Saral's pointed out, Ulkaji also pointed out that again. It's about the change in the incentive structures. Now what is happening essentially is that when we actually, let's for example, there will be a lot of focus on decentralized rooftop, of course, which has not really happened in Indian context. We have really not done great job in decentralized solar rooftops. And in fact, if I recall, when Sir was in Delhi, we did some project in Denkanal. We do not know actually that is an off-grid project. And what happened to off-grid projects, nobody knows about it. Delhi set up 300 plus solar lantern stations. Now when the decades and dead ends, and what would happen to them? Off-grid projects.
Example of
Yeah,
dead ends.
example of dead ends. So clear dead ends. Nobody knows. So many off-grid solar projects are deployed in different parts of the country, remote area. Odisha, we did 4 sir. Nobody knows what happened to that. Now the question is that if you are thinking of decentralized energy systems, and let's expect that you are moving away from the grid-based system to completely rooftop. Now certain incentive structures today are routed through the grid. I'll give one example of demand side management scheme. You have some kind of tariff structure called time of the day tariff, TOD tariff. That means whenever there is more demand, you charge high to the consumer, lower demand, you charge low. Now if your grid is no more there, we expect think of 70, 20, 50, 20, 40, 20, 70. If the electricity is not supplied through grid, then the incentive structures routed through grid are not going to work. And it has been observed in USA. We are moving away from a dock curve towards a canyon curve. So that means that there are disruptions coming in, there are disturbances coming in. So are we prepared at a decentralized level? How much preparedness we have? When you think of, this kind of changes at an international and national scale, we also understand how that translates, percolates down at a decentralized level, which will be doable, manageable and acceptable and people-centric. So I'll stop here. Thank you once again for giving me this time.
We can take few questions if anyone is interested.
So the question is not to a particular panel, but yeah, everybody here can answer, and it's just a thought I was wondering. So when we talk about low carbon transition and also people-centric, it boils down to the livelihood perspective, right? So, and then livelihood perspective again is when we talk about in India, in an Indian scenario, where let's say coal-dependent districts or places in India. So the livelihood scenario in this kind of districts are very mono-industrial setup, where everyone in those places, in all the possible ways, dependent on that particular one industry, and there are not other livelihood options. So, and we also talk about diversification discourse when we talk about low carbon transition. So, is there, what kind of possibilities we have to diversify the economy in this region? And if so, then, and again, more environmentally sustainable. And then when ma'am has talked about reskilling and skilling of people in and around those industries, or people who are dependent on the fossil fuel industries. So, is there any possibility that we can map those skills and see what kind of reskilling can be done? So when we transition to the other side of the economy, which is more environmentally sustainable, based on the renewables and all, so they are not left behind. They are well fitted into those industries. And last question, when we talk about generating livelihoods in the renewable-based sector, it's also about green jobs. And the now definition of green jobs seems to be very vague. So how can we define green jobs in our Indian context? This is just this is the thought I was wondering. Thank you so much.
See, you have given the employment numbers to different sectors. These employment numbers are calculated based on whether the entire supply chain is located within India or total. If some of these supply chain come from the imported, are you the number including that part or excluding that?
Can I ask a question, Dr. Mishra? Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Please go ahead.
So I'm Dwarkeshwar Das from School of Public Policy, IIT Delhi. So you talked about mission life, incorporating lifestyle changes. I just want to ask, it's a big deal. I mean, if we see our current lifestyle in the capitalist economic paradigm, do you see this kind of change, this kind of mission life, change? It would require a completely new economic paradigm. And since you said that because you spoke with people in government and they say it's more or less rhetoric, where do you see the possibility of this kind of transformational change happening? Do you see a possibility of ground up? I mean, how will this happen? And if this is so essential to happen, I mean, how can we promote this transition? Because it's not a technological transition.
Now, I think you can answer.
What we are living with, they have not been trained about conservation of anything. And we have, for GDP sake, we have been taught to make expenditure. And our state government has created energy clubs in all the government high schools. And we are teaching them, all the government high schools, we are teaching them to educate their parents how to save energy. And this way, they are also engaged in repairing of LED poles, huge LED poles. Some technical knowledge are being given. So Odisha is in this time is thinking of coming up with to counter the mission life, to adopt the mission life among the present generation through their children. Because you see now our children, when we are doing something wrong, they are scolding us not to do this, and we are obeying. So this will be the reverse way, I think, if we want to achieve the mission life goal. So I think it is the best way to learn from our children. We should teach them and learn from them again. Thank you.
Beyond awareness, also there are multiple entry points. I think one should look at the philosophy behind mission life, and then extend it when it comes to execution. It should not be restricted only to what the mission life envisages in a mission mode. Although there are a lot of beyond mission life also. You have your startups, and they present a huge opportunity to bring in innovations in the lifestyle domain. What kind of innovations young entrepreneurs, youth startups can actually bring in when it comes to low carbon lifestyles. Or let us say, skill India. Skill India itself is all about local. In Odisha itself, think about Mission Shakti, the kind of a mobilization that has happened. It's community mobilization at a huge scale. Now that's where you use that as an entry point to bring in actually lifestyle changes. So it's about basically identifying the entry points and introducing.
Energy consumption are also being carried out to Mission Shakti.
Exactly. So the thing is that the entry points need not be one. building material, so much technological advancement has happened on sustainable buildings. That is a very low hanging fruit. It simply requires the right kind of incentives, the right kind of procurement policies. All government policies, or government can have a procurement policy that all government public funded infrastructure will have building material that has a certain a low carbon content or or energy efficient content in that. For example, we are in Nepal. We are looking at the brick kiln sector, the bricks, and there was a big focus on clean bricks. Like how do you shift the fuel from coal to biogas pellets or to gasification, and not only that, but also in the design of the kilns, you can make these extremely energy efficient. And what we propose to the government is that all government infrastructure that use bricks can simply procure. It's a procurement policy. Just in your tendering, you say that though people can tender only those who are willing to bring in clean bricks, and it entirely changes the sector. So these are like small tricks in the incentive arena which can bring about lifestyle changes. Already we have Bureau of Energy Efficiency that comes out with your star rating. That's a very underreported, underwhelmed kind of a initiative, but in terms of a regulatory practice, it's a huge innovation. The only thing is that people are not being made aware about what this star rating involves, and if at all markets are not being regulated, why they shouldn't be keeping these star rated appliances to a minimum. So induction stove, for example, that's that changes. If you go to rural areas, the kind of fuel replacement it has happened through the use of induction stoves. So there are multiple entry points in terms of incentivizing appliances, bringing in energy efficient material.
Actually, I think I am to say that my view is charity begins at home. The government should come up with its buildings, its infrastructures, how it is being done. And as far as government of Odisha is concerned, we are in a process to replace all the old conventional fans. You will find 30-40 years. We are replacing BLDC fans. BLDC fans consume only 28 watt to 32 watt, whereas the normal conventional consumes 72 watt. We have already changed in our capital hospital, in Secretariat, Rajiv Bhavan, and also AAA Bhubaneswar. In fact, in AAA Bhubaneswar, we have joined 1500 BLDC fans, and we are showing that whatever we want to teach the people to change their mission life. So we are doing it ourselves, and we have implemented motion sensors in my building, and in Secretariat building it is going on process. Motion electrical sensors. So we are in a plan. We are just adopting 5-star estimations where new buildings are being constructed, and also replacing the old ACs with 5-star estimations. We are in a plan to show it by ourselves, so that it can be, the message can pass on to the public. So that is the way how to start with. The government should show by its own. It should begin at home. Mission life behavior should be shown by the government itself.
Just 1 minute to
The electricity or using the electric efficient appliances. There's much beyond that. But now it is
We're just
just
2 minutes
The
to
behavior concept will come.
just I'll supplement. We are talking about the human index, human development index. One of the parameter is lower per capita electricity consumption. That is one of the parameters, not only the parameters. At the same time, we are talking about life, reducing the per capita energy consumptions. Are those not contradictory? And are we ready to do that? Question is, are we ready to change our behaviors to follow this mission called life? Are we ready? Really, we are not.
No, that's a very good question, and that's the fundamental, that's. So what?
I just to add to it.
I think just
We are
here
just
we have
one-
to see when we talk of this capital consumption, we cannot mix up these two. When we build scenarios, we always take into account efficiency improvements. We always take into account that yes, behavioral changes. But this behavioral change has to go much beyond just this replacement. It has to go into our thinking that when you go out of the switch of the air conditioner, switch of the light, that is not happening. And for this, education has to start right from kindergarten level.
Yes.
We have to have this a part of curriculum at primary school level. And I have seen this happening in Japan, where these concepts are built into education at the school level. It has to start from there, then only it will build up.
Yes, yes.
And towards that end, I think efforts in our country are suboptimal.
In Odisha, I'm just to add to it, in Odisha in class 9th and 10th, we have curriculum of energy conservation in class 9th and 10th since 2021, and shortly we are going to have some topics in class 6th, 7th and 8th also. And we are getting a lot of benefits out of it.
This is required.
Yes, so many competitions are going on, online competition, drawing competition, painting competition, and they are being rewarded. And we are also giving rewards and energy to all sectors, almost 8 sectors. And also,
So I think we can discuss over lunch. We have.
At present, we are going for quarterly competition among the households.
We can close now.
If you wanted to respond to Professor Kohit's comment, no, we're not assuming that everything will be manufactured in India, which is why you see the manufacturing increases the least. But construction, servicing, repairs, all that will be in India. I wanted to also briefly answer your question about economic diversification. I can only give 3 different examples. One is at the Panchayati Raj level. So, for example, in Karnataka, the Panchayati Raj department is skilling women at the village level to drive the e-waste, the electric vehicles for solid waste collection. So, as part of the process where solid waste management plans are being made, they're also doing skilling of women. For the state level, Jharkhand has a Just Transition Task Force. At a national level, many agencies like Coal India, NTPC, Indian Oil are planning to become energy companies. So they will also have to take this on. But the issue will be that when the skilling is done, are there then new green jobs? And the timing of the skilling also has to be such that it happens while people are already in their jobs or their old jobs. Perhaps you may even have to make a choice where you choose to support the early retirement of older workers in coal mines and coal power plants in order to let the younger workers stay on in those plants that remain in the 2040s. So there will be deliberate plans that will have to be made. Yeah.
Thank you all the
there are many
speakers.
examples that you can.
I just wanted to give